cruel man abandons two dogs on the road, but he never imagined who would save them. The muffled sound of the engine fading away echoed down the icy road as two small golden figures shivered by the wooden post. The snow kept falling, slowly covering the footprints of the man who had just left, abandoning what he saw as nothing more than a burden. Honey and Cinnamon, two 3-month-old golden retriever puppies huddled together trying to stay warm. The thick rope tying them to the post was wet and cold, and their tiny bodies trembled from both fear and the freezing air. They didn't understand why their owner, who had fed them every day until then, had brought them to this empty place and left them there. The rural road winding through the mountain region of Aspen near New York was quiet on that winter afternoon. The biting wind carried snowflakes that settled on the puppies' golden fur, creating a white layer that made them look even smaller and more helpless. Cinnamon, the younger one, whimpered softly as she tried to hide under Honey's body. Though only a few days older, Honey already showed a protective instinct. The wooden post they were tied to stood at the edge of a rural property, surrounded by tall pine trees that cast long shadows over the snow. Not far away, Martha Wilson walked slowly along the dirt road leading to her small farm. At 68, she carried the weight of a lifetime spent caring for others, but in recent months, since losing her husband Robert, she had felt lonelier than ever. Her daily walk to town for groceries was one of the few things that still motivated her to leave the house. Martha had been an elementary school teacher for over 40 years, and even in retirement, she kept the habit of observing everything around her carefully. That's why, even from a distance, she noticed something unusual in the familiar landscape. Two small golden spots stood out against the white snow near the old post marking the entrance to the Johnson property, which had been abandoned for years. As she approached slowly, Martha's heart clenched when she realized they were two puppies, clearly abandoned and desperate. Honey lifted his head as she drew near, his brown eyes shining with a mix of hope and fear. Cinnamon kept shivering, even more frightened by the stranger's presence. "My goodness," Martha murmured, kneeling in the wet snow without caring about the cold seeping through her clothes. "Who could do such a thing to you?" The puppies watched her cautiously, but Martha's gentle voice and slow movements made Honey inch forward slightly, still restrained by the rope. The situation was clear. Someone had tied the puppies to the post and left them there, letting fate decide what would happen to them. Martha examined the rope carefully. It was thick nautical rope, tightly knotted, clearly chosen so it wouldn't come undone easily. Whoever had done this wanted to make sure the puppies stayed put. This wasn't an impulsive act, but something planned and cruel. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now back to the story. With trembling hands from both the cold and emotion, Martha began loosening the knots. It was difficult work. The rope was wet and the knots were tight. As she worked, she spoke softly to the puppies, trying to calm them. "Easy now, little ones. Aunt Martha will get you out of here. No one deserves to be left out in the cold like this." Her words carried more meaning than she even realized. Ever since Robert had left, she also felt abandoned, as if the world had become a cold and empty place. Seeing those two helpless creatures in a similar situation awakened something inside her that had been dormant for months. When she finally managed to free the puppies, they didn't run away. Instead, they approached her hesitantly, as if they knew that this gray-haired woman with gentle eyes was their only chance of survival. Martha wrapped them in her wool coat and carried them against her chest. The walk back to her house was long and difficult. The puppies were heavier than they looked, and Martha, though she had always been a strong woman, felt the weight of the years on her shoulders. But there was something about the situation that energized her in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time in months, she had a mission, a purpose beyond just existing day after day. Her home, a simple white-painted wooden house with blue trim, stood isolated on 2 acres surrounded by pine trees. It was the home she had built with Robert over 45 years of marriage, every corner filled with memories of a shared life. Inside, she placed the puppies on the living room rug near the fireplace, which hadn't been lit in months. The house was cold and silent, a reflection of the state she had been in since being left alone. But now, watching the two little ones, cautiously exploring their new surroundings, she felt an urgency to make the place more welcoming. She lit the fireplace and prepared a cozy spot for them with some old blankets. In the kitchen, she warmed milk and offered it in small bowls. Honey and Cinnamon drank eagerly, clearly starving and dehydrated. As she watched them eat, Martha couldn't stop thinking about who could have done such a thing. In the area, everyone knew each other, and she knew there were a few people who didn't have much patience for animals. But abandoning puppies like that went beyond any cruelty she could imagine. That night, the puppies slept near the fireplace while Martha lay awake for a long time, thinking about what to do. She didn't have the means to keep two dogs, especially two that would grow so big. Her retirement was modest, and since Robert had passed, she'd struggled just to keep the house in good shape. But there was something in those puppies' eyes that touched her deeply. It was as if they too understood what it felt like to be lost and abandoned in the world. During the IDAP night, whenever a nightmare woke her, she found Honey's watchful gaze as if the puppy was keeping guard over everyone in the house. The next morning, Martha decided she needed to find whoever was responsible for abandoning them. Not for revenge, but to understand why, and most importantly, to make sure the puppies were legally under her care. Her years as a teacher had taught her that unresolved problems tend to come back even more complicated. She dressed in her best clothes and walked into town, leaving Honey and Cinnamon safe at home with food and water. Aspen was a small town where news traveled fast, and she knew someone must have information about golden retriever puppies in the area. Her first stop was the local vet clinic, a small but well-equipped practice run by Dr. Jennifer, a skilled professional in her 40s who cared for most of the animals in the region. Martha had taken her cats there a few times when Robert was still alive. "Mrs. Wilson, it's so good to see you," Jennifer said with a genuine smile. "It's been a while. How have you been?" "Trying to adjust, Doctor," Martha replied. "But today I came here for another reason." Martha told her about finding the puppies, describing them in detail. Jennifer's face gradually closed off as she listened to the description. When Martha finished, the vet let out a deep sigh. "Mrs. Wilson, I have a suspicion about who might have done this, but it's a very delicate situation." Jennifer explained that in recent weeks, she had treated a golden retriever in labor, belonging to Richard Thompson, a construction businessman who had recently moved to the area. The dog had given birth to 4 puppies, but Richard had made it clear from the start that he didn't intend to keep any of them. He said the dog got pregnant accidentally and that the puppies were a problem he needed to solve quickly. I offered to help find homes for them, but he said he'd handle it himself. Martha felt indignation rising in her chest. "And where does this man live?" "He bought the old Miller farm, the big one at the end of the main road. But Mrs. Wilson, I must tell you, Richard isn't an easy person to deal with. He's known to be, let's say, short-tempered." Jennifer hesitated before continuing. "About 2 months ago, he brought in a cat with a broken leg. Said the animal had learned not to mess where it shouldn't. I could never confirm it, but the way the cat reacted around him worried me deeply." Martha absorbed this with growing concern, not just for the puppies she'd found, but for the other 2 that might still be in that man's hands. If her suspicions were correct, Honey and Cinnamon had escaped something even worse than abandonment. "Doctor, I need to ask something important. If I keep these puppies, is there any chance the original owner could legally claim them?" Jennifer thought for a moment. If he truly abandoned them intentionally, there's little he could do legally, but you'd need proof of abandonment, and of course, you'd have to register them under a new owner. Martha thanked her and left the clinic with more questions than answers. The road to the Miller farm was long, but she knew she had to confront Richard, not just for Honey and Cinnamon, but potentially for the other 2 puppies still in danger. The farm sat at the end of a dirt road winding through pine-covered hills. It was an impressive property. A large modern main house, well-kept stables and wide pastures where a few cows grazed peacefully. Clearly, Richard had significant means. Martha knocked on the front door and waited. When it opened, she faced a tall, sturdy man in his mid-40s. His cold eyes flashed with irritation at the sight of a stranger on his property. "What do you want?" Richard asked without courtesy. "My name is Martha Wilson. I came to talk about two golden retriever puppies I found abandoned on the road yesterday. Richard's expression shifted subtly, a mix of surprise and what Martha read as poorly disguised guilt. No idea what you're talking about. If you found some stray mutts, take them to the pound. They weren't mutts, Mr. Thompson. They were golden retriever puppies about 3 months old tied to a post with nautical rope. Exactly like the puppies your dog recently had. Richard crossed his arms, his posture turning defensive. Even if they were mine, what I do with them is my business. If I dumped them, it's 'cause I didn't want them. Now they're yours. The coldness in his voice left Martha stunned. She had expected denial, maybe anger, but not this cruel indifference in the face of the suffering he had caused. And the other two puppies, what happened to them? That's none of your business. Martha felt a sudden fear settle in her stomach. The way Richard avoided answering suggested something terrible. Mr. Thompson, if something happened to the other puppies, that could be considered animal cruelty. It's a crime. Richard took a step forward, his presence becoming intimidating. Ma'am, I suggest you take your 2 mutts and get off my property. And if you come back here or spread rumors about me around town, you'll have bigger problems than worrying about dogs. Martha stepped back, her heart racing. There was something dangerous in Richard's tone, something that made her realize she was dealing with a potentially violent person. But at the same time, she couldn't just give up knowing there might still be other puppies in danger. Where are the other two? She insisted, trying to keep her voice steady despite her fear. Richard moved even closer. The other two learned to swim in very deep waters. The implication of his words hit Martha like a punch to the gut. She retreated a few more steps, realizing she was facing someone capable of cruelty beyond her comprehension. You couldn't have done that. I can do whatever I want on my property, and now I suggest you leave before I call the police. For trespassing. Martha turned and hurried back to the road, her heart pounding wildly. Richard's words echoed in her mind, and she had to stop several times on the way to catch her breath, not just from the physical effort, but from the emotional impact of what she had discovered. When she got home, she found Honey and Cinnamon waiting anxiously by the door. Seeing the two puppies safe and healthy brought immense relief, but also a terrible weight. They were the only survivors of a situation that had ended tragically for their siblings. That night, Martha barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Richard's cold stare and heard his cruel words. She knew she had to do something, but she wasn't sure what or how. At 68, she had never faced such cruelty before. The next morning, she decided to seek help. Her first stop was the house of her nearest neighbor, Frank, a 72-year-old retiree who had been a state police officer for 30 years. If anyone could advise her on what to do, it would be him. Frank lived about 500 yards away, in a modest but well-kept house. He and his wife, Dorothy, had been friends with Martha and Robert for many years. Since Robert had passed, they had tried to stay in touch more often with Martha, worried about her isolation. "Martha, what a lovely surprise," Dorothy said as she opened the door. "Frank was just saying it had been a while since we'd seen you." Martha was welcomed with hot coffee and homemade cookies, but her worry was evident. When she told Frank the whole situation, she saw the retired officer's face grow stern. "Martha, what you're describing is very serious. If your suspicions are correct, this man committed animal cruelty, and the way he threatened you is also concerning." Frank explained that even though he was retired, he still had contacts in the police and could guide her on the right steps. But there was a problem. Without concrete proof of what happened to the other puppies, it would be hard to make formal accusations. The best thing would be to get some evidence of what he did. But Martha, I have to warn you, if this man is truly as dangerous as he seems, you shouldn't approach him alone again. Dorothy, who had been listening quietly, spoke for the first time. "Martha, why don't you just keep the puppies and let this whole thing go? You already saved them, isn't that enough?" But Martha knew she couldn't simply forget. The image of the other two puppies haunted her, and there was something about Richard that made her feel other animals might be in danger in the future. "I can't just pretend nothing happened, Dorothy. If he was capable of doing that to helpless puppies, what else could he do?" Frank agreed. "She's right. People like that rarely stop at their first crime. I'll make a few calls and see what we can find out about this Richard Thompson. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing. In the following days, Frank used his connections to quietly investigate Richard Thompson. What he found was disturbing. Richard had moved to Aspen after trouble in his previous town, also related to animals. There were records of neighbor complaints about excessive barking that suddenly stopped, and rumors of pets mysteriously disappearing near his old property. But the evidence was always circumstantial, never enough for formal charges. Richard seemed smart enough to never leave clear traces of his activities. Meanwhile, Martha devoted herself to caring for Honey and Cinnamon. The puppies quickly adjusted to their new home and already showed distinct personalities. Honey was braver and more adventurous, always exploring every corner of the property. Cinnamon was more cautious and affectionate, preferring to stay close to Martha and constantly seeking her attention. The puppies completely transformed Martha's routine. For the first time in months, she had a reason to wake up early, to care about something beyond her own sadness. The house, which had grown silent and cold, now echoed with the sounds of play and the innocent joy of the two little ones. But this newfound happiness was shattered when, a week later, Richard showed up at her property. Martha was in the backyard, watching Honey and Cinnamon play when she heard the sound of an engine approaching. Seeing Richard's car stop at the gate, she felt an immediate rush of fear. Quickly, she called the puppies inside before going to answer. Richard stood at the gate, but his presence radiated intimidation even from a distance. "I've come for my dogs," he said simply. "What do you mean, come for them? You said yourself you abandoned them, that you didn't want them." "I changed my mind. They're mine by right, and I want them back." Martha felt the ground shift beneath her. After a week of caring for the puppies, the idea of handing them back to that man was unthinkable. "Mr. Thompson, these puppies were abandoned. When I found them, they had hypothermia and could have died. You forfeited any right to them." Richard opened the gate without permission and took a few steps toward the house. "Ma'am, I won't repeat myself. Bring me my dogs now, or I'll have to get them myself." "You can't enter my property without permission. That's trespassing. And you can't keep someone else's property. That's theft." Martha realized she was in an impossible situation. Legally, Richard might have a point. Even though he'd abandoned the puppies, technically they were still registered as his property. But morally, giving them back would be like sentencing them to a terrible fate. "I'll buy the puppies from you," she said, trying one last option. "How much do you want for them?" Richard smiled cruelly. "They're not for sale. I want them back because they're mine, and also because I don't like it when people interfere where they shouldn't." His true motivation was clear. It wasn't about the puppies. It was about control and intimidation. He had come back to show he wouldn't accept any questioning or interference in his actions. "You have until tomorrow at noon to bring them to my farm. If you don't, I'll return here with the police." Robert turned and left, leaving Martha in shock. She knew she needed to act fast, but wasn't sure how. The idea of handing over Honey and Cinnamon to that man was unacceptable, yet confronting him directly seemed impossible. That night, she called Frank and told him about Robert's visit. The former officer was clearly worried. "Martha, this situation is getting dangerous. That man isn't interested in the puppies. He's trying to assert power over you. This could escalate into something much worse." Frank suggested she seek legal help, but they both knew legal proceedings would take time, and Robert had given her only a few hours. "There's another option," Frank said after a long pause. "You could take the puppies far from here, at least temporarily. I have a brother in Steamboat Springs who could shelter them until we resolve this." It was a temporary solution, but at least it would keep Honey and Cinnamon safe. Martha agreed, though her heart ached. After just a week, she'd already grown deeply attached to the puppies, and the thought of being separated from them, even briefly, was painful. The next morning, very early, Frank arrived with his car to take the puppies. Martha had packed a bag with food, toys, and the blankets they'd been using. Honey and Cinnamon seemed confused by all the commotion, but trusted Martha enough to let themselves be placed in the car. I promise I'll come for you as soon as it's safe, Martha said, kissing both puppies on their heads. Frank drove carefully, down the dirt road, and Martha stood at her gate watching the car disappear among the pine trees. The house, which had been full of life the past week, fell silent and empty again. A few hours later, as promised, Robert returned. This time, he wasn't alone. A man Martha didn't recognize, just as intimidating, stood beside him. "Where are my dogs?" Robert demanded as soon as Martha opened the gate. "They're not here anymore," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Where are they?" "Somewhere. Safe, far from you." Robert's face darkened threateningly. "Ma'am, you're starting to seriously irritate me. Bring me my dogs now, or the consequences will be much worse than you imagine. I already told you I won't hand over those puppies to someone who mistreats them." Then Robert did something that completely changed the nature of the conflict. He picked up a large rock and hurled it through Martha's living room window, shattering the glass. "The next one will be at your head," he said coldly. Martha retreated inside, locking the door and trembling with fear. She'd never felt so vulnerable and defenseless. Through the broken window, she could hear Robert shouting threats outside. "You have 24 hours to bring my dogs back. If you don't, I'll come back here, and I promise you'll regret crossing me." The sound of the car driving away brought temporary relief, but Martha knew the situation had escalated into something far more serious. Robert had crossed the line from verbal threats to physical violence, and she had no doubt he'd follow through on his promises. She immediately called Frank, who rushed to her house. When he saw the broken window, his expression turned grave. "Martha, there's no question now. You need to file a police report. This was vandalism and a direct threat." Together, they went to the Aspen State Police Station. The officer who assisted them, a young and seemingly competent man named Brian, Carter listened carefully to Martha's account. "Ma'am, I'll file the report, but I need to tell you that technically the puppies are still legally Mr. Thompson's property. The fact that he abandoned them doesn't automatically transfer ownership." "But he admitted to abandoning them," insisted Martha. "Yes, but we'd need to prove that formally, and even if we did, he could claim it was temporary, not permanent." The officer explained that cases involving animal ownership were legally complicated, especially without clear documentation of property transfer. "What I can do is increase patrols near your home and advise you not to open the door for him again. If he causes damage or makes threats, call us immediately." Martha left the station feeling even more unprotected. The law, it seemed, was on Richard's side, at least technically, and the threat of physical violence was real and immediate. That night she slept poorly, jumping at every noise on the property, terrified Richard would return to carry out his threats. The house without the comforting presence of Honey and Cinnamon felt even more isolated and vulnerable. The next morning she got an unexpected call. It was Dr. Jennifer, the veterinarian. "Mrs. Wilson, I need to speak with you urgently. Can you come to the clinic?" When she arrived, Jennifer seemed nervous and worried. "Mrs. Wilson, last night I had a very strange visit. Richard Thompson showed up after hours, banging on the door and demanding information about the puppies. Jennifer said Richard had tried to force her to reveal where the puppies were, claiming she must know since she'd advised Martha on their veterinary care. He was clearly agitated, ranting about how people who meddle in other people's business need to learn lessons. I even thought about calling the police. The situation was spreading beyond Martha. Richard was dragging others into his search for the puppies, making him even more dangerous. "Doctor, I'm so sorry I got you involved in this," Martha said, guilt weighing on her. "Don't worry about that. I'm worried about you. That man is clearly obsessed, and people like that can be unpredictable." Jennifer suggested Martha reach out to local animal protection organizations. "There's a group in Fort Collins that handles complicated abuse cases. Maybe they can guide you better." It was a new hope. Martha wrote down the information and decided to contact them immediately. If local law couldn't protect her properly, maybe specialized organizations had more resources and experience for cases like this. Her contact with the NGO Protected Paws was eye-opening. The coordinator, a woman named Fiona, listened to Martha's story with growing concern. "Mrs. Wilson, what you're describing is a pattern we've seen before. People who abuse animals often escalate to violent behavior against humans too. Fiona explained that the organization had handled similar cases and that there were specific legal strategies for animal abandonment situations. The first step is formally documenting the abandonment. We need photos of where the puppies were found, witnesses if possible, and veterinary records of their health when they were rescued. It was exactly what Martha hadn't thought to do in the moment. Her immediate concern had been saving the puppies, not documenting the scene for legal use later. It would also help to gather more information about this man's history with animals. If we can establish a pattern of behavior, we'll have a stronger case. Fiona offered the services of a lawyer specializing in animal rights who volunteered with the organization. It was a real chance to turn the legal situation in favor of the puppies. But there was a problem. The whole process would take weeks, maybe months, and Richard had made it clear his patience had much shorter limits. That same afternoon, as if he had sensed Martha was seeking help, Richard showed up again. This time, he didn't get out of the car. He just honked repeatedly until she came out to see what he wanted. "Found my dogs yet?" he shouted from the car window. "I already told you I won't hand them over to you." "Then you're choosing the hard way." Richard started the car and accelerated sharply, sending rocks and dirt flying toward Martha. It was a clear intimidation tactic, a show that he could be impulsive and dangerous. That night, Martha made a decision that would change the course of the whole situation. She called Frank and asked him to bring the puppies back. "Martha, are you sure? It's dangerous to have them here while that man is acting like this. I'm sure I can't let him win by intimidating me. And most of all, I can't abandon Honey and Cinnamon like he did. They need a home, not to be shuffled from place to place." Frank tried to dissuade her, but recognized the determination in her voice. "All right, but you can't stay alone with them. Dorothy and I will take turns staying with you until this gets resolved." It was a plan with significant risks, but Martha knew she couldn't live with herself if she kept running. The time had come to face Richard directly, with the support of friends and the legal help she was organizing. The next morning, Frank brought Honey and Cinnamon back. The puppies, now almost 4 months old, had grown noticeably in the week they'd been away. When they saw Martha, they ran to her with a joy that warmed her heart after days of tension and fear. "I missed you so much," she murmured, hugging the 2 puppies who pressed against her as if they never wanted to let go. But the happy reunion was interrupted when, late that afternoon, Richard showed up again. This time, he seemed to have prepared a different strategy. "I see you brought my dogs back," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "They're not yours. You abandoned them. I have the paperwork proving they're mine. I bought the mother with a registered pedigree. I have receipts for everything. Want to take it to court and see who's right." Richard held up a folder with documents that apparently backed his claim. Martha realized he had legally prepared for this moment. Even so, abandonment is abandonment. It's a crime against animals. "Prove I abandoned them. Prove I left them on that road. Your word against mine, and I own a $2 million property while you're just a retiree." The casual cruelty in his words about the social gap between them revealed much about his personality. To Richard, people were categorized by their financial worth and animals were just property. "Mr. Thompson," Frank interjected, stepping out of the house upon hearing the voices. "I suggest you resolve this through the proper legal channels. I won't stand for you coming here to intimidate my neighbor." Richard sized Frank up, clearly weighing whether escalating the confrontation was worth it. "And who are you to interfere? I'm Frank Johnson, retired from the state police, and I know exactly how to handle people who make threats and damage others' property." For the first time, Richard hesitated. The presence of a former officer changed the dynamics. "This isn't over," he finally said. "I will pursue all legal means to recover my property, and when I succeed, you'll regret causing me so much trouble." Richard left, but his threat lingered in the air. The situation had now officially turned into a legal battle, with Martha on one side and a man with significant financial resources on the other. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, back to the story. In the days that followed, Martha immersed herself in legal preparations. With the help of the NGO Protected Paws and the specialized attorney Dr. Richard Anderson, she began building a formal case against Richard. Dr. Richard was a man in his 50s with extensive experience in animal rights. When he reviewed the situation, he got straight to the point. Mrs. Wilson, we have some points in our favor, but also some significant challenges. The main issue is that the abandonment wasn't properly documented when it happened. The lawyer explained that while Richard had the purchase documentation for the puppy's mother, it didn't automatically grant him rights over the litter, especially if intentional abandonment could be proven. We'll need witnesses, evidence of the puppy's condition when they were found, and most importantly, more information about this man's history with animals. It was a daunting task, but Martha was determined. Over the next few days, she visited all the neighbors in the area, searching for anyone who might have seen Richard on the road the day of the abandonment. That's when she discovered something crucial. Mark, a farmer who lived a few miles away, remembered seeing a car similar to Richard's that day. I remember because I thought it was odd for someone to stop by that old pole. There's been nothing there for years, but I was too far away to see what the person was doing. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was a start, Dr. Richard advised Martha to formalize this testimony and keep searching for evidence. Meanwhile, life with Honey and Cinnamon was settling into a new routine. The puppies, now growing quickly, had completely transformed Martha's property. What was once a quiet, melancholic place had become full of life and movement. Honey had developed a curious and protective personality. Whenever a car approached, he was the first to alert, barking in a way that always let Martha know someone was coming. Cinnamon, on the other hand, was affectionate and intuitive, seeming to sense when Martha was worried and coming to offer comfort. Their presence had brought back a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since losing Robert. Every morning, she woke early to feed them and take them for walks around the property. At night, they slept close to her, creating a sense of security and companionship she had deeply missed. But this routine was interrupted when a week later, Martha received a court summons. Richard had filed a repossession lawsuit, claiming she had illegally taken his property. Dr. Richard examined the documents with a serious expression. He's being advised by a very competent law firm from New York. That means he has resources and is taking this seriously. The summons required Martha to attend a conciliation hearing in 2 weeks. If she couldn't prove her claims about the abandonment, she would be forced to return the puppies immediately. Doctor, what happens if I lose this hearing? If you lose, you'll have to surrender the puppies and may also be ordered to pay compensation for emotional and material damages. Richard is claiming he suffered damages from the wrongful appropriation of his animals. It was a situation that had spiraled completely out of control. What had started as a simple act of compassion had turned into a legal battle that could have significant financial consequences for Martha. That night, she lay awake, wondering if she'd made the right choice. Maybe if she had simply ignored the puppies that day, none of this would have happened. But as she looked at Honey and Cinnamon sleeping peacefully by the fireplace, she knew she couldn't have done differently. The next morning, she received an unexpected visit. It was Jennifer, the veterinarian, accompanied by a woman Martha didn't know. Mrs. Wilson, this is Susan Parker. She has important information about Richard. Susan was a woman around 40, clearly nervous and hesitant. She lived in Boulder, Richard's previous town, and had learned about the situation through mutual contacts. Ma'am, I know it's risky to talk about this, but I can't stay silent after what I've heard. Richard, he did terrible things to animals in our town. Susan explained that she had been Richard's neighbor for 2 years in Boulder. During that time, several neighborhood pets had mysteriously disappeared, always after some minor conflict with Richard. My cat vanished after it did its business in his yard. Mrs. Helen's dog disappeared after barking too much one night. Always the same pattern, a small conflict, and then the animal was never seen again. But the most revealing part was that Susan had witnessed one of the incidents firsthand. I saw him throwing a bag into the river behind his property. The bag was moving, and I heard muffled meows from inside. When I tried to intervene, he threatened me, just like he must have threatened you. It was exactly the kind of evidence Dr. Richard Anderson had said they would need. Susan was willing to testify formally, even knowing the risks of retaliation. "Why are you doing this?" Martha asked. "Because I have 3 young children, and if this man is capable of doing such things to defenseless animals, I don't even want to imagine what else he could do. By standing up to him, you might be protecting others too." The perspective shifted entirely. This wasn't just about saving Honey and Cinnamon anymore. It was about potentially stopping Richard from causing more suffering to animals and intimidating more people. Dr. Anderson was encouraged by the new testimony, but remained realistic about the challenges. "It's very important evidence, but we still need more. Richard will deny everything, and without physical proof, it's still her word against his." Then Susan mentioned something that changed everything. "I recorded one of the incidents on my phone. I couldn't see clearly what was inside the bag, but the video shows him throwing something into the river, and you can clearly hear animal sounds. It was the proof they needed. A video showing Richard disposing of something in the river with animal sounds would be enough evidence of mistreatment to support the case of abandoning the puppies. But there was a problem. Susan had recorded the video over a year ago and wasn't sure if it was still on her phone. "I'll look, but I can't guarantee I'll find it." The following days were filled with growing tension. The conciliation hearing was approaching, and without the video, Martha's case remained fragile. She tried to maintain a normal routine with Honey and Cinnamon, but the anxiety was constant. Then something unexpected happened. Martha was in the backyard with the puppies when she saw an unfamiliar car slowly approaching her property. It wasn't Richard's car, but she had learned to be cautious about any unexpected visitors. The car stopped, and out stepped a young woman, apparently in her 30s, carrying what looked like another golden retriever puppy. "Sorry to bother you," the woman said hesitantly as she approached. "My name is Patricia. I've been looking for you because I heard you rescued 2 abandoned puppies." Martha confirmed but remained cautious. Over the past few days, she had learned that not every approach was well-intentioned. "The reason I'm here is that I found this puppy on my property 3 days ago. He showed up alone, skinny and scared. Based on his size and features, I think he might be a sibling to yours." Martha's heart raced. If true, it meant not all the other puppies had suffered the fate Richard had suggested. Patricia explained she lived on a farm about 10 miles away. The puppy had appeared on her property overnight, clearly lost and searching for food and shelter. "I took him to the vet, who said he's about the same age as yours, and the physical traits are very similar." When Patricia brought the puppy closer, the resemblance to Honey and Cinnamon was undeniable. The golden coloring, the shape of the ears, the size, everything suggested he was indeed one of their siblings. But the most moving part was the puppy's reaction. Honey and Cinnamon grew excited upon seeing the 3rd puppy running toward him with a joy that could only come from family recognition. "How did you know to look for me?" Martha asked. "In town. Everyone's talking about your fight against Richard Thompson. When I found this puppy and the vet suggested it might be related to your case, I decided to investigate. It was an extraordinary revelation. Not only had one of the puppies survived what Richard had done, but he had also found his way to safety." Dr. Richard Anderson was immediately informed of the development. To him, the appearance of the 3rd puppy represented crucial additional evidence. If we can prove this puppy is truly a sibling to the other 2, it strengthens our argument that Richard intentionally abandoned them in different places, hoping they wouldn't survive. Patricia was willing to testify about how she had found the puppy, including his poor health and signs of recent abandonment. "But I'd like to make a proposal," she said. "If you can prove this puppy belonged to Richard and confirm he was abandoned, I'd like to adopt him officially. I've already grown attached, and I can provide a good home." It was a perfect solution. Not only would another puppy be safe, but Martha would have another ally in the legal battle against Richard. That night, the 3 puppies slept together for the first time since being separated. Seeing the siblings reunited brought Martha a joy she hadn't felt in a long time, but it also strengthened her determination to protect them. The next day, Susan Parker called with extraordinary news. "I found the video. It was in an old folder on my phone, and it's even clearer than I remembered." Dr. Anderson immediately scheduled a meeting to review the evidence. When he saw the video, his optimism grew significantly. Mrs. Wilson, this completely changes our case. We now have visual proof of Richard discarding something that clearly contained a live animal. Combined with the testimony about the abandoned puppies, and now the appearance of the third, we have a clear pattern of behavior. The mediation hearing was scheduled for the following week, and for the first time since it all began, Martha felt she had a real chance of winning. But Richard wasn't idle. A few days before the hearing, he made one last attempt at intimidation, showing up at Martha's property with two men she didn't recognize. "Last chance," he shouted from the gate. "Hand over the dogs now, and I'll forget this whole thing. Keep up this nonsense, and I guarantee you'll regret it for the rest of your life." This time, Martha didn't back down. With Frank and Dorothy present, and knowing she had solid evidence to present at the hearing, she responded firmly. "Mr. Thompson, we'll see each other in court. There, you can make your case legally." "Court?" Richard laughed scornfully. "You really think any judge will believe the word of a retiree over mine? I have the best lawyers in New York." "Then we'll find out." Richard was visibly irritated by Martha's newfound confidence. He was used to bullying people until they gave up, but now he faced someone who wouldn't back down. "Fine, but when you lose everything in court, remember you had the chance to settle this amicably." Richard and his companions left, but their presence left a tension in the air. Martha knew that no matter the outcome of the hearing, Richard wasn't the type to accept defeat easily. The night before the hearing, Dr. Richard Anderson went over the case one last time with Martha. They had Susan Parker's testimony about the mistreatment in Boulder, the video showing Richard dumping an animal in the river, Patricia's account of the third puppy's condition when found, and the veterinary records documenting Honey and Cinnamon's health at the time of rescue. "We have a strong case," Dr. Anderson said, "but brace yourself for a fight. Richard brought expensive lawyers and they'll try to discredit our witnesses and evidence." Martha barely slept that night, not out of fear but anticipation. For the first time in months, she felt she was fighting for something bigger than just the 3 puppies. She was fighting against the idea that people with more money could inflict suffering without consequences. On the morning of the hearing, she dressed in her best clothes and headed to the courthouse with Dr. Anderson, Frank, Dorothy, Susan, and Patricia. It was a small group, but united by a common cause. The Aspen Courthouse was an old, imposing building that had always intimidated Martha on the rare occasions she'd visited it in her life. But today, she felt strengthened by the presence of her supporters. Richard arrived with 3 lawyers in expensive suits carrying leather briefcases. The visual contrast between the two groups was stark, and for a moment, Martha doubted whether she stood a chance against such legal firepower. The judge overseeing the case was Judge Helen Morrison, a woman in her 50s, known in the region for her seriousness and impartiality. When the hearing began, she first heard arguments from Richard's defense. His lead attorney, August Miller, presented a technically flawless case. He showed documentation proving Richard's ownership of the puppy's mother, vaccination records, and registration papers, arguing that Martha's wrongful taking of the puppies constituted theft. "Your Honor, my client is the lawful owner of these animals. Even if there was temporary abandonment, that doesn't transfer ownership. The respondent took possession of someone else's property and now refuses to return it." August then attacked Martha's credibility, suggesting that an elderly woman emotionally shaken by the recent loss of her husband might have misinterpreted the situation. It's understandable that the respondent became attached to the animals in a moment of emotional vulnerability, but that doesn't justify taking someone else's property. It was a cruel strategy, but legally effective. Richard remained impassive throughout the entire hearing, as if the outcome were a mere formality. When it was Dr. Richard Anderson's turn to present the defense, Martha felt the weight of responsibility. Everything hinged on the next few minutes. "Your Honor, this case is not about property. It's about abuse and the intentional abandonment of defenseless animals." Dr. Anderson began by recounting the story from the puppy's perspective, describing the conditions in which they were found and their poor health. Then, he presented Susan Parker's testimony. When the video played in the courtroom, showing Richard discarding something into the river while muffled meows could be heard, the impact was visible even on the judge's face. Your Honor, this video shows a clear pattern of behavior by the plaintiff toward animals. The abandonment of these puppies was not an isolated act, but part of a documented history of mistreatment. August Miller tried to challenge the evidence, arguing that the video was old and not directly related to the case of the puppies. But when Patricia testified about how she had found the third puppy, the connection became undeniable. 3. Puppies from the same litter, abandoned in poor conditions in different locations, all traced back to the same original owner. That can't be a coincidence. The hearing lasted over 3 hours. Richard was called to testify and vehemently denied all accusations, insisting the puppies had run away from his property and that he was only trying to recover them. But when confronted with the video and Susan's testimony, his story began to unravel. His answers grew evasive, and his irritation became obvious. I don't have to explain what I do on my property to anyone, and I certainly won't accept accusations based on old videos and witnesses with questionable motives. It was then that Judge Helen Morrison asked a question no one expected. Mr. Thompson, where are the other puppies from the litter? The question caught Richard completely off guard. He hesitated for several seconds before answering. They were given to interested families. Which families? Can you provide their contact information? I don't have that information with me. The judge took careful notes. You will need to provide this information within 5 business days. The hearing is adjourned until the plaintiff can verify the whereabouts of all the puppies in the litter. It was an unexpected development that completely shifted the case's momentum. Richard left the courthouse visibly angry, while Dr. Anderson explained to Martha the significance of what had just happened. If he can't prove the other puppies were legitimately given away, it strongly supports our argument about abandonment and abuse. Martha returned home with a mix of hope and apprehension. The hearing had gone better than expected, but she knew Richard wouldn't give up easily. Over the next 5 days, the tension was constant. Richard didn't show up at her property, but his absence was almost more unsettling than his intimidating visits. On the day of the resumed hearing, Richard appeared without the requested documents. His lawyer argued that the families who had taken the puppies were traveling and couldn't be reached immediately. Judge Morrison wasn't convinced. Mr. Thompson, you had 5 days to provide simple evidence about the whereabouts of animals you claim are yours. The absence of this information is in itself significant evidence. The judge's decision was clear and final. Considering the evidence presented, including the documented history of abuse captured on video, the health condition of the puppies when found, and the plaintiff's inability to prove the proper whereabouts of the remaining animals in the litter, I declare that there was intentional abandonment. Richard tried to protest, but Judge Helen continued. The puppies found by the defendant are legally declared abandoned, and therefore current custody is deemed legitimate. The request for repossession is denied. More than that, the judge ordered the case to be forwarded to the district attorney's office for investigation of potential animal cruelty charges. Richard left the courthouse in silence, but the look he gave Martha was loaded with threat. She knew she had won legally, but she also knew men like Richard didn't accept defeat easily. Dr. Richard advised her on the necessary precautions. Mrs. Martha, officially the case is resolved in your favor, but people like Richard may resort to extra-legal retaliation. Stay alert and don't hesitate to call the police if he approaches your property. Martha returned home with Honey, Cinnamon, and the third puppy, whom she had decided to name Sunny, accompanied by all the friends who had supported her in the fight. It was not just a legal victory, but a moral one. Patricia formalized Sunny's adoption, but it was agreed the 3 siblings would continue to meet regularly. Martha's property, which had once been silent and melancholic, now echoed with the playful barks of Honey and Cinnamon and Sunny's frequent visits. In the following weeks, life settled into a new normal, though transformed. Martha had found not only companionship in the puppies, but also a support network in the community that had formed around the fight. Susan, who had taken personal risks to testify, became a close friend. Patricia with Sonny made regular visits. Frank and Dorothy, who had always been good neighbors, now felt like family. "You know," Martha told Dorothy during one visit, "when I found those puppies on the road, I thought I was saving them, but I think they saved me." The loneliness that had dominated her life since Robert's passing had been replaced by a sense of purpose and community. The puppies had brought back not just joy, but also the inner strength she thought she'd lost forever. Meanwhile, Richard faced his own battle. The district attorney's investigation into animal cruelty had expanded to include other suspicious cases at his current and former properties. Susan hadn't been the only one willing to testify against him. A month after the court's decision, Martha learned from Dr. Richard that Richard had sold his ranch in Aspen and moved to another state. Apparently, the legal and social pressure had become too much. "Sometimes people like him just run when they realize they can't act with impunity anymore," Dr. Richard explained. "What matters is that you're safe, and he can no longer cause trouble for animals in this area." Richard's departure brought Martha a final sense of relief. For the first time in months, she could fully relax on her property, knowing there were no lingering threats. The story, however, had spread throughout the region and beyond. Local newspapers covered the case, and Martha began receiving messages from others who had faced similar situations with abandoned or mistreated animals. That's how an idea emerged, one that would change her life even further. During a conversation with Dr. Richard and Jennifer, the veterinarian, the proposal came up to create an informal support group for people rescuing abandoned animals. "Mrs. Martha," said Jennifer, "your experience has shown how important it is to have legal and veterinary support when someone tries to do the right thing. What if we use this network that formed to help other similar cases?" The idea was simple but effective. Create a group that offered legal guidance, veterinary support, and emotional assistance for people who found themselves in situations like the one Martha had faced. "It wouldn't be anything formal or complicated," explained Dr. Richard Anderson. "Just a network of people willing to help each other when someone tries to do right by an animal in need." Martha embraced the idea with enthusiasm. It was a way to turn her painful experience into something positive that could benefit other animals and people in the future. The group started small, with only the original participants from Martha's struggle. But as the story spread, more people became interested in joining. Veterinarians offered discounted checkups for rescued animals. Lawyers volunteered for abandonment cases, and families signed up as potential adopters. 6 months after finding Honey and Cinnamon on the road, Martha was organizing the group's third monthly meeting in her own home. The property that had once been a quiet refuge had become a gathering place for people who shared a passion for animal protection. Honey and Cinnamon, now healthy young dogs, moved among the guests as natural hosts. Sonny visited regularly with Patricia, and the three siblings had become living symbols of the importance of not giving up when it comes to protecting the vulnerable. During one of these meetings, Jennifer brought up a case that echoed Martha's original experience. A family had found abandoned puppies and was facing threats from the supposed original owner. "This is exactly the kind of situation we created this group for," said Martha, now experienced in handling complex cases. "Let's offer all the support they need." As she coordinated help for the new case, Martha realized how much she had changed since that fateful day on the road. The woman who had once felt lost and helpless after losing her husband had become a confident and experienced advocate for animal rights. "Robert would be proud," she murmured to Honey, who rested at her feet while she reviewed the documents for the new case. "He always said I was stronger than I thought." Life had taken on a rhythm and purpose Martha never imagined possible. Mornings began with caring for Honey and Cinnamon, followed by work with the Animal Protection Group, afternoons dedicated to visits and support for other cases, and quiet evenings at home with her four-legged companions. A year after it all began, Martha received an unexpected call. It was from a journalist in New York who was preparing a story on community-led animal protection initiatives. "Mrs. Martha, we heard about the puppies you saved and the group you started afterward. We'd like to include you in our feature on people making a difference in animal welfare. At first, Martha hesitated. She had never sought publicity or recognition for what she did, but Dr. Richard encouraged her to accept. Mrs. Martha, sharing your story could inspire others to act when they face similar situations, and it might discourage people like Richard Thompson, knowing there are support networks for those who report abuse. The article was published in a major newspaper and had a greater impact than expected. Martha began receiving messages from people across the state, asking for guidance on how to handle cases of abandonment and mistreatment. What had started as a local group had expanded into an informal statewide network, connecting people willing to help animals in need with resources and specialized knowledge. 2 years after finding Honey and Cinnamon, Martha was assisting her 50th case of animal abandonment. Each story was unique, but they all shared similar elements: cruel people who treated animals as disposable objects, and compassionate individuals willing to step in despite the risks and challenges. What I've learned, Martha said during an interview for a magazine dedicated to animal protection, is that most people want to do the right thing, but often don't know how or are afraid to face the consequences alone. When we offer support and guidance, we find there are far more good people than we ever imagined. Honey and Cinnamon, now magnificent adult dogs, had become unofficial ambassadors for the cause. Whenever Martha gave presentations on animal protection, they accompanied her, serving as living proof that fighting for the vulnerable is worth it. The transformation in Martha's life had been complete. The woman who once felt lost and without purpose had found a mission that gave meaning to each day. The house that had grown silent and cold was once again full of life, not just with Honey and Cinnamon's presence, but with the constant flow of people united by a common cause. One Sunday afternoon, 3 years after it all began, Martha sat in the backyard watching Honey and Cinnamon play with Sunny, who had come for one of her regular visits. Patricia chatted with Susan Parker about a new case they'd taken on, while Jennifer examined puppies rescued the previous week. Who would have thought, Martha mused, that finding 2 abandoned puppies would change so many lives? Not only had her own life been transformed, but dozens of other animals had been saved through the network that had formed. People who once felt isolated in their struggles had found support and guidance. And perhaps most importantly, the community had become more aware of the importance of protecting the vulnerable. That night, as Honey and Cinnamon curled up beside her like they did every evening, Martha reflected on the journey they'd taken together. What had begun as a simple act of compassion had turned into a lifelong mission that brought purpose, friendship, and joy. "Thank you," she whispered to the 2 sleeping dogs. "You taught me it's never too late to start over, and that the best things in life come when we do what's right, even when it's hard." Outside, the road where it all began lay quiet under the moonlight. But now any abandoned animal there would quickly be found and cared for by the protection network Martha had helped build. Cruelty still existed in the world, but there were fewer places where it could act with impunity. And in the house, Robert had built with so much love, but which had become a place of loneliness. Laughter, conversation, and the sound of paws running through the yard echoed once more. Love had found a new way to express itself, not replacing what had been lost, but creating something new and equally precious. The final entry in the journal Martha had started about her experience read simply, "Today marks 3 years since Honey and Cinnamon came into my life. I'm no longer sure who saved whom on that cold road. Maybe that's the magic of compassion. It always transforms both the giver and the receiver." End of story. Now tell us what you thought of the story and where you're reading from. If you have something to share with us, leave your honest thoughts in the comments. Do you think Martha made the right decision? We'd love to hear your opinion. Thank you so much for your company. Don't forget to leave your like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss other heartwarming stories.